So this is how we're going to be making our gluten balls. We have our strainer with the cheesecloth, which will be important a little bit later. I've got my saran wrap in the back, a knife, a little bit of water in a small container, and then my 25 grams of flour. Now I put the flour into this container on purpose because I know what I need to do is I need to form this flour into essentially what's going to be about a golf ball. And then I'm going to be putting that gluten ball back into this container and covering it with water. So I wanted to make sure that I had enough depth in my container that I could put something essentially golf ball size back in here. So our first step, we're going to slowly add some water, and I'm only adding it little bits at a time because sometimes what'll happen is you'll add some water and everything will come together super quickly. Now you might think it's a little strange that I'm using a knife to mix together my flour and water, but that again is intentional. I don't want anything to stay stuck on this knife. I'm just adding enough water to try and get this to come together, to stick together in a nice little golf ball. I don't want to add too much water. I don't want to over mess with it. I just want it to barely come together. And I want to make sure that I can get all of the flour off of my utensil. So that's the beautiful thing about using a knife. It just all slides off really quickly. I want to zoom in here because at this stage, it doesn't really look like it's going to come together. But that's the beauty of some of these flours, is that if I work with it just a little bit and I use my fingers, taking that damp edge and pushing it into the dry pieces, it suddenly starts to come together. The biggest mistake that people will make is adding too much water and then it's just a mush. And if it's a mushy pile that can't come together, this experiment does not work well at all. So I need just one more, just a drippy drop. And that will pull in all of these last little pieces. It's okay if we have some dry bits on the bottom, but we really want to make sure to get all the flour into this nice, tight little golf ball. So you'll see that I'm squeezing it a little bit, kind of rolling it to get it into that cohesive unit. So now we have our gluten ball. It's just come together. I'm putting it back into my bowl. I'm now going to cover it with water. Temperature of the water doesn't matter. Just kind of normal tap water temperature is fine. I'm next going to cover this with saran wrap so it doesn't dry out. We don't lose a whole bunch of water to evaporation. And now I forget about it for an hour. So in an hour, this will be ready for us to do the second part of experiment. Exercise B, excuse me, I think I called it exercise A earlier. This is exercise B, making our gluten balls. While we are ignoring this, that water is going to be helping the two proteins to come together, the glutenin and the gliadin. They're going to come together, start to get their groove on. In about an hour, this will be ready for us to finish the rest of the experiment. So my gluten ball has been sitting here in the water for about an hour. I'm going to very gently pour out all of that water. And I want to go ahead and rinse this dish. The reason why is because I know I'm going to be using this dish to help me in this experiment. So, rinsed out the container really well. I'm going to fill it with some clean water. I'll show you why here in just a minute. So, in the sink, I'm going to put my strainer with my cheesecloth, and the whole point of doing this is to make sure that none of the little starchy bits, none of the bits of my dough go down the drain. I do have a garbage disposal, so it's not that big of a deal for me here at home, but if we were in the lab in class, we wouldn't want any of the dough to go down the drain. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the water, I want this water to constantly rush over the gluten ball. Taking my hands, I'm going to gently grab and squeeze, moving that dough ball back and forth. But you notice how I never, ever take it out of the stream of water. That water constantly rushing through this gluten ball is what is going to wash away all of the starch. So at this step, what we're doing is we're washing away all the starches, and hopefully that will leave us with nothing but protein. Now, one of the things I want to do is I want to test. I want to see if my gluten ball still has a lot of starch. So I'll take my gluten ball and give it a squeeze over my water. Look at how cloudy those drops are. That means there is lots and lots of starch still in this gluten ball. So I'm going to keep going. Keep squeezing and squeezing and squeezing. I'm going to test again. Still very starchy. So here I'm giving it a squeeze, and we can see there is almost no starch coming out. My droplets are almost perfectly clear. The other thing I want to point out here is my ball has definitely decreased in size, and that's because I've washed away a lot of those starches. So now what I have is a nice cohesive little ball, and this should be almost pure protein. Now, one of the things I want to point out is for some of you, you may start rinsing away the starches and it very quickly starts to dissolve. Stop before it gets to the very end. In other words, don't let everything go down the drain. We want to have at least a little something, even if that little something is as tiny as the piece here. That's still a really important thing. So now that I've got my gluten, I'm going to put it on a little piece of parchment paper. And if you've never used parchment paper before, this stuff is amazing. It can go right into the oven. And the reason why I'm using the parchment paper is, as you can see, this pan is pretty gross. And I don't want this little dough ball, this little gluten ball to stick to my pan. And by putting it on the parchment paper, this will keep it from sticking. So now I'm going to put this in a 200-degree oven. I'm going to essentially dry it out. 200 degrees is really, really low. And what we typically do in lab is we leave it in that 200-degree oven overnight. So about 8 to 12 hours in that 200-degree oven to dry it out. Bring the dried gluten ball to class so we can weigh it. I want to point something out. When this is dry, it's going to be fragile. So take your container. Hopefully you've got a good lid for it, like I have a lid for this one. And when this is all dry in the oven, put it in your container so you can safely bring it to lab so we can weigh it and use that measurement in class. I hope that this helps you understand the exercise B, making of gluten balls. If you have any questions, please, please, please email me.